Stefon Diggs is one signature away from coming home to Ashburn, and today we've got proof Adam Peters is personally monitoring the whole situation. In a minute, I'll break down why John Keim says Diggs is literally the only name left on Washington's board, and why the clock just sped up, because Chiefs receiver Xavier Worthy went down with a shoulder injury this weekend, which could pull Kansas City straight into the Diggs sweepstakes. Meanwhile, 30 years. 30 years waiting on a bus that still hasn't come. Joe Jacoby, the best hog this franchise ever had by its own admission, got snubbed by the Hall of Fame again, and I'm getting into the full injustice behind that one. And to close it out, the Commanders made a move up front right before pads came on, signed center Trey Hill, cut corner Trey Hawkins, and there's a reason behind that swap tied to an injury nobody saw coming. DMV, stick around, because we're just getting started. Raise hail. Okay, this is one I've been tracking week after week, and I finally feel like there's something real behind the smoke. Let's set the full context, because a lot of people just saw the headline and don't get why this is such a big deal. Start with the obvious part. Washington's receiver room has a problem, and that problem has a name: the lack of a reliable number 2 receiver behind Terry McLaurin. Right now, the depth chart behind Scary Terry is Antonio Williams, Luke McCaffrey, Treylon Burks, Diami Brown, Jalen Lane, and Van Jefferson. Those are decent names, some with real upside, but none of them is, today, a receiver that a defensive coordinator has to game plan around. And camp hasn't helped that perception. Reports coming out of Ashburn in that first week describe the room as underwhelming, and in beat reporter language, that usually means there still isn't real separation between the options. And that's exactly where Stefon Diggs comes in. Let's talk about who this player actually is in 2026, because a lot of people still remember the Minnesota version or the Buffalo version, and that's not quite the player who'd be available right now. Diggs was drafted in the 5th round by the Vikings back in 2015, which I always love bringing up because it says everything about how badly this league sometimes evaluates receivers. He signed a 5-year, $72 million extension in 2018, and in 2020 the Vikings traded him to Buffalo for a package that included a 1st-round pick. Buffalo gave him a 4-year, $104 million deal, and for several seasons he was, without exaggeration, one of the 5 most productive receivers in the entire NFL. Then came the setback. Midway through the 2024 season, playing for Houston, Diggs tore his ACL. It looked like it might be the beginning of the end for a receiver already in his 30s. But he signed with New England on a 3-year deal that was functionally structured as a 1-year prove-it contract. And here's the piece of this story I think matters most. Diggs didn't just recover in time for the 2025 season. He played all 17 games, 85 catches, 1,013 yards, 4 touchdowns, and he was a key piece in getting the Patriots to the Super Bowl with Drake May at quarterback. Listen to that again. A 32-year-old receiver coming off a torn ACL, playing the full 16 or 17 game slate and putting up 1,000 yards, still functions at the highest level once the scheme uses him right. That's what actually matters here. The real production on the field, not the age written on paper. So why is he still available? 2 reasons, and I'm going to be honest about both of them. First, cap space. New England restructured its receiving room this offseason, trading for A.J. Brown from Philadelphia and signing Romeo Doubs, so Diggs' number no longer fit the financial plan. Second, and I'll say this plainly because you all deserve the direct version, Diggs faced a legal case involving a strangulation charge. He was found not guilty at trial. That's a verified fact, not my opinion. But for a stretch, that uncertainty combined with the cap number kept teams from moving fast on him. Now that the case is resolved, the market has started to react, which brings me to the piece of news that actually lit the fuse this week. ESPN's Jeremy Fowler said on SportsCenter that Washington is intriguing to Diggs, and he explained why. Jaden Daniels as the young quarterback, plus the fact that Diggs is from Maryland, played his college ball right there in College Park, is literally a hometown kid from the DMV. That's already a nice story on its own. But what really made me pay attention was the report from John Keim, ESPN's Washington beat writer, someone who's covered this franchise since the 90s and doesn't throw names out there without real backing. Keim reported that Adam Peters is actively monitoring Diggs' situation, and according to Keim, if Washington signs another receiver this summer, everything points to it being Diggs specifically, not some generic receiver. Diggs, by name. And let me pause here for a second because I need you to understand the difference between a freelance reporter's rumor and this. When Kame says something like that, it's coming from real conversations inside the building. That doesn't mean the deal is close, not even close. It means the conversation is serious, and there are 3 fresh pieces of information that change the clock on this whole story. First, the NFL formally closed its personal conduct investigation into Diggs, citing insufficient evidence to determine a policy violation, so there's no legal or administrative cloud hanging over this anymore, just the question of which team moves first. Second, according to reports from this same week, it's not just Washington in the conversation. There are 3 specific teams in the race: the Commanders, the Ravens, and the Chiefs. And third, this one's worth watching closely. On Saturday, Kansas City receiver Xavier Worthy left practice on a cart with a shoulder injury, the same shoulder he dislocated in week 1 of last season. The initial scare was real, but reports from this same Sunday, including Ian Rappaport's, say Worthy is believed to be okay. Still, the pattern bothers me. This is the second time in a year that shoulder has given him trouble, and that keeps the underlying urgency alive for the Chiefs, even if it wasn't the emergency it looked like on Saturday. If Kansas City eventually feels like it needs to reinforce that receiver room, Washington doesn't get the luxury of comfortably waiting until the price drops in August. Now, my personal take, and I know this might spark some debate in the comments, I would sign Diggs today if I were sitting in Adam Peters' office, and I'm saying that with my eyes wide open to the risks. Yes, he's 32. Yes, he's coming off a serious knee injury. Yes, there's a legal history that, even resolved in his favor, is still an uncomfortable conversation for any organization. But look at the context. The Commanders reached the conference championship 2 seasons ago with Jaden Daniels as a rookie. The contention window is already open. This isn't a team rebuilding, it's a team that needs to maximize every single piece around its franchise quarterback while he's still on his rookie deal, which is exactly when smart teams spend capital on veteran talent. And tactically, Diggs doesn't compete with McLaurin, he complements him. McLaurin is the deep threat, the guy who stretches the defense with vertical routes and wins one-on-one on the outside. Diggs is a possession receiver, short and intermediate routes, separation through technique rather than pure speed, exactly the kind of player David Blau, the new offensive coordinator, is going to need for his play-action system. A young quarterback like Daniels needs safe options on 3rd and short, and right now, Washington doesn't have that behind McLaurin. And there's another layer here worth thinking about, because this goes beyond just needing a receiver. Blau's offensive philosophy leans heavily on play action and quick clock concepts. Short routes run with precise timing so Daniels can get the ball out before the protection breaks down. Diggs, at his best, is exactly that kind of receiver. He wins with release and cut, not with raw speed, and he has reliable hands in contact zones where younger defensive backs usually win the physical battle against less technical receivers. In last year's scheme under Kingsbury, a receiver like that would have been a luxury. In Blau's new system, I'd almost call it a structural necessity. And here's my most personal take in this whole segment, the one that's probably gonna draw some pushback in the comments. The Diggs comes home story is a story I love, but as an analyst, I'm not fully buying it as a guarantee that everything goes smoothly. Diggs has a real track record of public friction with young quarterbacks. He was seen more than once arguing with Josh Allen on the sideline in Buffalo when things weren't going his way. And Jaden Daniels is exactly that, a young quarterback still building his authority in that locker room. If Diggs shows up thinking he can treat him the way he treated Allen in his worst moments, this turns into a headache fast. My take, and I say this with all the enthusiasm I have for the signing intact, is that Washington needs to cap this deal at 1 year, no exceptions, specifically to protect the locker room dynamic if the relationship doesn't click. That's not me being difficult, that's asset protection. And even with that caution attached, I still think the risk is worth taking. I could be wrong about all of this, and I'll own that. The real risk is health. Diggs didn't have any serious physical issues in 2025 by all accounts, but 1 more year of wear on a rebuilt knee is 1 more year of risk, and that's a variable no free agency report can guarantee you either way. But if he shows up in Ashburn healthy, and everything suggests Peters is waiting specifically to confirm that before he moves, this receiver room changes categories completely. And the signals this week, Peters personally monitoring, Fowler confirming the mutual interest, Kame saying it's the only name on the list. Tell me this isn't a question of if anymore, it's a question of when and probably how much it costs. My prediction, he signs with Washington before August ends, on a short deal, 1 year or maybe 2 at most, with a low base number and performance incentives. And if that happens, this offense goes from having a real question mark at receiver to running one of the best WR1 WR2 combinations in the entire NFC. I needed that tonal shift because what's coming next hits a different nerve for me. ESPN asked each of their team reporters to name the player who best used a training camp to launch his career, one per franchise, across the entire history of the league. And the name John Keim picked for Washington was Joe Jacoby. If you're a younger fan of this channel, you probably don't know the full story, so let's tell it right because this isn't just nostalgia, this is about an injustice the organization itself acknowledges and the league keeps refusing to fix. Jacoby arrived in Washington in 1981 as an undrafted free agent out of Louisville. Undrafted. And the story the organization itself tells is almost funny if it wasn't so telling. Joe Gibbs, in that very first camp, thought Jacoby was a defensive lineman because of his size. That's how far off the radar this kid was when he showed up in Ashburn. He was literally the last offensive lineman added to that camp roster. And even with all of that working against him, he started 13 games as a rookie, 8 of them at left tackle. That start was the beginning of a career that defined an entire era of football in Washington. Jacoby became the starting left tackle for 8 straight seasons, then moved to the right side of the line for his final 5 years in the league. He finished his career with 148 games started, 2 first-team All-Pro selections, and 4 Pro Bowls. And here's the fact that actually bothers me every time I sit with it. Jacoby was, according to the franchise itself, the best player on the Hogs, that legendary offensive line from the 1980s and early 90s that helped win multiple Super Bowls under Gibbs. We're talking about one of the most respected offensive lines in the history of the sport, and the man Washington itself points to as the best of that group still doesn't have a bust in Canton. Let's talk scheme for a second because I want you to understand why Jacoby mattered tactically and not just as a story. In an era when football still leaned heavily on the power run game, a left tackle his size with that kind of lateral movement was rare. The Hogs didn't just open holes, they imposed a whole style of play, controlling gap integrity against loaded fronts, and giving Riggins and company room to run between the tackles against stacked defenses. Jacoby anchored that scheme from the left side, protecting the quarterback's blind side in an era without the protection rules that exist for passers today. Now, the uncomfortable question, why isn't he in the Hall of Fame yet? Honestly, I think part of the answer has to do with how the offensive tackle position has been historically undervalued compared to skill positions. But here's what makes this year's snub sting even more. Jacoby isn't some forgotten name the voters never considered. He was a finalist in the modern era category back in 2016, 2017, and 2018 before aging into the seniors category, and he's been nominated at least 5 times since 2019. For the class of 2026 specifically, he actually made it to semifinalist, one of 9 seniors still standing after 2 rounds of cuts. And then, this past December, he didn't advance to the final 3, so close, and still on the outside. Canton's voting committees have prioritized quarterbacks, receivers, running backs, and pass rushers for decades, leaving offensive tackles, especially ones who played in an era without advanced pass block win rate stats, fighting for scraps of attention despite career numbers comparable to or better than players already enshrined. Look, I'm not saying every tackle from that generation deserves automatic entry. But when your own organization in an official league article calls you the best player on one of the most iconic offensive lines in the history of the sport, and you're still getting stopped 1 round short of Canton year after year, there's a real problem with how this position's history gets written. And this isn't just a player from one lucky stretch either. Jacoby played alongside other Hogs like guard Russ Grimm, who was inducted into the Hall of Fame in 2010, and center Jeff Bostic on a line so iconic it had its own nickname and its own identity in the locker room, which is rare for any offensive line in any era of the NFL. The fact that Grimm made it to Canton and Jacoby keeps stalling 1 round short when both were central pieces of the same group under the same system during the same championship years is exactly the kind of inconsistency that fuels this debate, and this can connects directly to what's happening in Ashburn right now. Laramie Tunsil arrived this offseason and signed his extension almost immediately, giving Washington stability on one side of the line. Josh Connerly Jr., the 2024 first-round pick, is entering year 2 after a brutal rookie season facing elite pass rushers like Max Crosby and Micah Parsons. And Sam Cosmi is back after starting 58 games over 5 seasons. That lineage, from Jacoby to Tunsil, from the original Hogs to this new generation trying to rebuild Washington's offensive line reputation, is exactly why this story matters so much to me. This organization has a tradition of excellence at that position, and the league still hasn't recognized it the way it deserves. My final take on this, and this one's mine, not some reporters, I think part of the blame here isn't just on Canton's committee, it's on the franchise itself. Other teams, when they've got a case like this, run active lobbying campaigns, hire people specifically to put the player's case in front of the committee, year after year, with fresh documentation and new testimonials. I haven't seen Washington do that with the intensity this case deserves. If I were running the Commanders' PR office, I'd start a coordinated annual campaign right now with the Jacoby family and former teammates like Grimm, pushing specifically before every senior's voting cycle, instead of passively waiting to see if the committee remembers him on its own. He's earned it, and if you ask me, this channel is going to keep bringing this up every single chance we get. And to close things out, something lighter but with real tactical substance behind it. The Commanders signed center Trey Hill this week to add offensive line depth just in time for the first padded practice of this training camp. In the corresponding roster move, they released cornerback Trey Hawkins. Hill was a 6th round pick by the Bengals back in 2021, and he's stepping in to cover a real hole. Nick Allegretti, who was set up to start on the interior under Blau's new zone blocking scheme, is out with a calf strain. This move, small as it looks on the surface, tells me something important about how Adam Peters manages this roster. Zero tolerance for running thin at a critical position, even during camp. They didn't wait around to see if Allegretti got better in a couple days. They brought in someone with real NFL experience immediately, and Hill joins the team right as the physical part of camp actually starts. And here's my more critical take for this segment, because it can't all be applause for Peters. If the only real center depth before this move was a rookie from this year's draft, Matt Golban, and a player with all of 1 game of NFL experience in his entire career, Julian Good-Jones, that tells me the front office underestimated the injury risk at a position where Allegretti was arriving with a limited track record as a starter. It's not a major mistake, and the reaction was fast and correct, but to me, this confirms interior offensive line depth is still the soft spot of this roster, and this isn't the first time I've said that on this channel, because up until now, the first 3 days of camp were without pads, dedicated almost entirely to installing David Blau's new offensive system and Durante Jones's new defensive system. Communication, assignments, timing, everything you can evaluate without real contact. But Monday brought the pads, and that's when you actually start finding out the truth about this offensive line, about the rebuilt pass rush with Odafe Oweh and Kelevon Chason joining Darren Payne, Jerzan Newton, and Javon Kinlaw, and about the battle I personally care about most, Chris Paul against Brandon Coleman for the starting left guard job. Paul won that job last season and built real chemistry with Tunsil, but Coleman has more athleticism to handle the screen game. That matchup, now with real contact involved, is going to tell us a lot about who starts the season as the guy. And to wrap up with something that genuinely made me laugh this week, before individual drills, the offensive linemen themselves got a chance to catch passes from the quarterbacks, and not a single one dropped the ball. So now the Commanders know that if they ever need a trick play with an offensive lineman catching a pass, they've got plenty of options on the roster. It's a small detail, but I love it, because that's exactly where this team is right now, working hard on the serious stuff and still finding room to have fun in the process. And there you have it, an episode that started with the possibility of bringing home a receiver who could completely change this offense, moved into a historic injustice this organization still hasn't fixed, and closed with a small roster move that shows Adam Peters leaves nothing to chance, not even in the middle of July. This franchise has Super Bowls, it has legends like Riggins, like Sean Taylor, like Darrell Green, and it has a Hogs offensive line still waiting for the recognition it earned the hard way back in the 80s. And now it has the chance to bring one of its own back home, a kid from Maryland, to chase another ring with Jaden Daniels under center. I honestly cannot wait to see how this one plays out over the next few weeks. If this video gave you something, hit the like button, subscribe, and tell me down in the comments. Do you sign Diggs today, or do you wait to see more from camp first? I want to read every single answer. See you in the next one.